We would go into the room of somebody who was type 2 diabetic. And my preceptor would say, okay, we're going to teach them how to eat carbohydrates consistently. I would be like, oh, well, wait, I thought they were type 2 diabetic. I mean, can't they not tolerate carbs? Shouldn't we teach them how to reduce their carbs? We had a patient that had a traumatic car accident. So they were being fed nasogastrically with the tube. And I remember flipping over the ingredients and I'm like, oh my God, look at this. This is the exact same tube feed ingredients I was fed when I was 12 years old. I had a serious eating disorder and was in hospitalized inpatient. If someone's been in a car accident or they've had burns or they have cancer and we're feeding them nasogastrically, I mean, is this the best we have? The number one ingredients are maltodextrin, corn syrup, soy protein, and canola oil. And then I discovered the carnivore diet. Like many people, I was like, well, that's the dumbest thing I've ever seen. Like, why would you cut out fruits and vegetables? That was my indoctrination.
Yeah.
Most people don't go the extra step. And I was like, well, let me do some research on this. And I really did a deep dive into bioavailability. And that is something we are not taught as dietitians. What can my body actually use and absorb? And I found that meat and organs and animal fat was highly, highly absorbable. Our healthcare system is set up to where I cannot kill you, because if I kill you, I lose you as a customer, but I cannot heal you, because if I heal you, I lose you as a customer. I have to keep you perpetually sick.
Today, I have with me Michelle Hearn, a registered dietitian, an ultra runner, and author of The Dietitian's Dilemma. I'm very excited to have you on today because I had Jessica Turton on before this, and she's also a registered dietitian, nutritionist, and also emphasizes a more of a low carbohydrate, animal-based way of eating. And it's super interesting because here we have two registered dietitians who a lot of people kind of throw shade at nutritionists, right? Because they're not as credentialed, I guess, or regulated as, a dietitian is. And you have a lot more, I would say, nutritionists who do fall in line with like the low carb or the keto or like alternative, basically, diets, as you would have with the dietitian, who's more in line with like the conventional approaches, right? And so I found that kind of incredible that you had people that kind of totally went away from what they were indoctrinated with to begin with. So let's start there. For you, what started that transition to make you question everything, right?
Yeah, gosh, when I became a dietitian, I was a young dietitian. There was definitely things that I questioned. So I became a dietitian in 2009, and I got into the dietetic internship in 2008. And like you said, to become a registered dietitian, you get your 4-year degree, then you have to get into an internship and then sit for the exam. And when I was an intern, I just I saw things that didn't really make sense. For example, we would go into the room of somebody who was type 2 diabetic. And my preceptor would say, okay, we're going to teach them how to eat carbohydrates consistently, 60, 90 grams in the morning, and then 60, 90 grams in the afternoon, 60, 90 evening, and 15 grams of carbohydrate snacks. And I would just ask questions. I would be like, oh, well, wait, I thought they were type 2 diabetic. I mean, can't they not tolerate carbs? Shouldn't we teach them how to reduce their carbs? And I was always like, oh, no, everybody has to have carbohydrates. And then when we went to the ICU, we had a patient that had a traumatic car accident. So they were being fed nasogastrically with the tube. And I remember flipping over the ingredients and I'm like, oh my God, look at this. This is the exact same tube feed ingredients I was fed when I was 12 years old. I had a serious eating disorder and was in hospitalized inpatient. And so I just asked questions. I was like, hey, if someone's been in a car accident or they've had burns or they have cancer and we're feeding them nasogastrically, should the first ingredients of tube feeding formulas, I mean, is this the best we have? The number one ingredients are maltodextrin, corn syrup, soy protein, and canola oil. And I was just told like, oh, Michelle, it's calories in, calories out, but you're a student, you're trying to make your way, you're trying to learn. But as back then in 2009, the Academy of Nutrition, which was called the American Dietetics Association, which is the governing board of all dietitians, was sponsored by Hershey's, Coca-Cola, PepsiCo, Frito-Lay. It's not much better today. I've made a few videos and jokes that we are, as of 2021, the dietitians are now sponsored by the National Confectionery Association. So we are literally sponsored by candy.
Wow.
So, yeah, I mean, so, you don't have to be a member of the Academy of Nutrition to be a registered dietitian. And I have adamantly refused since I was much, younger, in my early 20s. I just thought correctly, in my opinion, that, sponsorship affects what you're being taught and what the continuing education you're receiving. But, it wasn't really until I lost my own health in 2019 that I made a big difference. But before then, practicing as an acute care dietitian, I really struggled. I brought it to the attention of my clinical directors that I just had this tremendous, you have so many patients you have to see. You have such little time to see people. And, you're just taught to teach them the nutrition guidelines, kind of the same nonsense that got them in this, in this mess in the first place, whether they're
Right.
type 2 diabetic, whether they have heart failure. And, just so people know too, like, we don't see patients that are like, oh, this person's, has diabetes, or this person. Most of the patients that an acute care dietitian will see, it's like a two sentence of what's going on with them. It's hypertension, COPD, obesity, like so many different things.
Mhm.
And we know a lot of these things are connected to nutrition. So anyway, yeah, in 2019, I was actually attempting to qualify for the Olympic trials in the marathon. I'd run a 254 at that time. You needed to run a 255 or under to qualify. And I was working a job. I was a neurodietitian. Well, I wasn't a neurodietitian, but I was new to the facility I was working at. I
Mhm.
was working at a psychiatric facility as well as a acute care facility. And my health just started to fail. Like all of a sudden during my runs, I wasn't recovering well. And, and this wasn't just like unusual soreness. I would go for a couple mile run and I would start to get cold sweats. My body was aching. I've struggled with anxiety my whole life, but it went from difficult to unmanageable to where I
Mhm.
was having to call out of work. I had a panic attack once and had to leave in the middle of a shift.
Mhm.
Things were bad. And so, of course, you do went and saw my family doctor, got some blood tests. It was like my magnesium was a little bit low. She was
Mhm.
like, "Oh, you just need spinach and we'll put you on an antidepressant." And I'm like, "No, that's definitely not it." I talked to two friends who are sports dietitians and they told me I needed more carbohydrates. At that point, I was eating about 300 grams. So, of course, being motivated, I doubled down, started eating 400 or 500 grams of carbohydrates, and things went from bad to worse. And, I always call it kind of my come to Jesus moment. I had a challenging day at the hospital. We had a patient pass away. I came home. I fell asleep like really early. Like I'm going to say, 2, 3 in the afternoon, just crashed. And I woke up in the middle of the night with just searing pain. Like it felt like my body was on fire.
Mhm.
And I remember standing in the kitchen and I didn't know what to do. I had tried, every over the counter anti-inflammatory. I tried stronger things. I tried, alcohol. Nothing was working. And so at 2 a.m., I drove to 7-Eleven and I got 20 pounds of ice. I put it in the bathtub. I'm in there crying. And my wife came in and was like, maybe we should do something differently. And at that point, I decided, yes, this is it. This is stupid. I am physically, mentally, spiritually broken. Like I'm done running. At that
Mhm.
point I was 36 and I'm too old to be competitive. This is dumb. I can't even, I wasn't showing up in any area of my life. I was not a great partner. I was a less than ideal employee, and my athletics, obviously was non-existent. So yeah, that was the point. I made a big change.
So at that point, you were following like the standard nutritional advice of whole grains, low fat, that kind of thing.
Yeah, and I think it's important to note that I at that point I still, I ate protein. I ate
Mhm.
meats. But I had a very high carbohydrate diet. And I would say mostly, those healthy quote unquote whole grains. We had a lot of rice, a lot of like, you know, gluten-free breads and pastas. But I had granola bars. I had, a sugary coffee drink. I always had some type of cookie or dessert. Yeah, and I certainly I don't think I went out of my way to be like low fat, but I didn't add fats to things for sure.
Right.
And I ate a ton of vegetables. Oh my gosh. I lots and lots of vegetables. Yeah, and I struggled too with chronically low iron. I was supplementing with iron quite a bit. Yeah, so it I I intuitively knew that carbohydrates did not make me feel well. Like I didn't like, I felt, sometimes I would feel that low blood sugar, but
Mhm.
I believed so strongly in all this indoctrination that I would need a certain amount of carbohydrates just to live. Like if I'm never going to run again, I'm going to need some. But as an athlete, well, God, I needed to get as many as my body could handle.
Hmm.
But
Right, right,
but
right.
it's funny how sometimes we'll continue in these patterns when they're clearly not working. And at that point, I'm grateful that I just, I decided like, well, if I'm not going to run, my body clearly needs a break. I'm
Hmm.
gonna go very low carb. I had intended to just do like a ketogenic diet. I was familiar with keto, and keto is a bad word in to most of the dietetics communities. It's very silly, when you look in the research. It's one of the most healthy ways of eating. But um, anyway, so then I discovered the carnivore diet. And I was,
Right.
like many people, I was like, well, that's the dumbest thing I've ever seen. Like, why would you cut out fruits and vegetables? But that was my indoctrination.
Yeah.
Most people don't go the extra step. And I was like, well, let me do some research on this. Let me look at this. And I really did a deep dive into bioavailability. And that is something we are not taught as dietitians. We are not taught about bioavailability, meaning what can my body actually use and absorb. And I found that meat and organs and animal fat was highly, highly absorbable. And I was like, wow, I really kind of skewed these things. Like I said, I ate meat, but I wasn't eating large quantities of meat. I certainly wasn't adding butters and tallows to my meals.
Hmm.
And so many plants can actually block the absorption of nutrition, specifically phytic acid. I mean, I probably,
Right.
I probably was eating more phytic acid from grains and oats and peanuts and stuff, peanut butter. And so, yeah, I was like, that's interesting.
Yeah.
Maybe this could change. Maybe this could change my health.
Yeah, no, and I want to begin to unravel. I know you already touched on some of the main topics, like the anti-nutrients, the metabolic health, blood sugar variability. But before we do that, I wanted to read like a small quote from the beginning of your book, which
Thank you.
said, "The current nutritional guidelines will keep you alive, but it may not be a life worth living." So, could you kind of expand on that a little bit? I know you already touched on your story from 2019.
Sure. Oh yeah, absolutely. Having worked in the hospital, for many years, I saw a lot of sickness and I saw some death, but I mostly saw people living the most profoundly unfortunate lives, and I'm
Mhm.
not talking like your 90, 100-year-old grandparents. I'm talking about people around my age, 30s, 40s, people even younger than me with heart failure. The people, when you follow the nutrition guidelines, you're likely going to fail. You're going to get diabetic. You're probably going to be obese. If you do not get enough fat in your diet, you are hungry. Our nutrition guidelines shift you to eating a lot of processed sugar and carbohydrates, which we also know can profoundly affect your mental health. So our healthcare system is set up to where I I cannot kill you, because if I kill you, I lose you as a customer, but I cannot heal you, because if I heal you, I lose you as a customer. I have to keep you perpetually sick.
Yeah.
And, we know specifically things like diabetes. Well, I mean, I was going to go with just diabetes, but unfortunately, heart disease and, depression and other things are increasing exponentially. But we'll just take diabetes.
Mhm.
That is a horribly painful disease, because yes, you want to do a consistent carbohydrate diet, you want to follow the nutrition guidelines, eat your chicken, eat your low fat salad, eat your rice. You're going to be hungry, you're going to be diabetic, um, and yes, you'll be alive, but you're probably going to go blind. You're probably going to have your leg cut off. You're probably going to have your teeth rot. Like, I've seen all these things. I've seen non-healing wounds. I was introduced to maggot therapy when I worked in Boulder, Colorado. I thought it was a joke. But we had people
Yeah.
with wounds that were so profoundly bad. You actually put maggots on people, people who
Oh
are
my
living,
God.
breathing. You put maggots to eat away the flesh.
Oh,
Yes. So, um, we now know, there's statistics that people are living longer. Even though there was a time when that dipped for a bit, but the quality of our years is just, is profoundly bad. If you're, in my opinion, if you're not able to get up and walk and smile and eat and do your activities of daily living, basic things, bathing, showering, that is not a good quality of life. And we have many people in their 50s, 60s, 70s that are unable to do just basic activities of daily living.
yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And I think that part of what gets misconstrued when we're talking about like looking at our, early hunter-gatherer ancestors, is the fact that there's a low average lifespan. And by
Mhm.
looking at that, you would say, oh, like what we're doing now is much better, right? Like our nutrition is great, our medicine is great. Like there's nothing that we can learn from them, right? But then if you actually start to look into the research on their lifespans and looking at, for example, median lifespan in the Hadza, for example, you see that they do live up to well beyond their 70s. And the reason for that low average lifespan is because you have the outliers such as a high infant mortality, right? But they don't have, once they get to that 70-year point, they don't have those chronic diseases like we do, right? And so there's just so much to be learned about a good quality of life rather than just extending a poor quality of life with pharmaceuticals.
Yeah. And, I mean, you nailed it. Unfortunately, people will look at, like the even like the Maasai and the Inuit
Mm-hmm.
Eskimos, and and be like, oh, look at, they're only living till 30 or 40 or 50, their life expectancy isn't that great. But
Right.
like what you said, they're pretty much free of chronic diseases. Like our
Mm-hmm.
healthcare system is like, if you are in a traumatic car accident, or God help you, or like have a massive wound,
Mm-hmm.
is amazing. Like
Yeah.
acute things, like I wouldn't want to be nowhere else in the world than America. Like if I'm in a car accident, they'll take care of you. But for chronic problems, it is an absolute nightmare.
Atrocious.
Absolute nightmare. Yes. And so I think it makes sense for us to look at primitive, like how can we get back? Obviously we want to utilize, like, I appreciate, indoor plumbing and sanitation and things like that to extend my life. But
Mhm.
by depending on our healthcare system as we get older, with all these pharmaceuticals and just nonsense recommendations, it's been it's causing, you don't have to be a scientist or a brilliant human to just look around you. Like, oh my gosh, I was visiting my sister this past weekend. She lives right outside of Anaheim, staying at a hotel. And I was shocked by how many obese children I saw. Like obesity, actually the highest demographic for obese humans is children ages 2 to 5, which makes me worry
Wow.
about the next generation quite a bit. But what we're doing with our health is we're basically setting people up to where they're gonna have chronic diseases, and then our treatment for chronic disease keeps them sick. It's a profoundly backwards system.
Yeah. Yeah. I want to give you the opportunity to see if I'm getting this right in terms of, what it is about the nutritional guidelines, which are, tend to hurt more than help in many instances. So we have like the anti-nutrients that you talked on, and we can also expand on those later on.
Sure.
Metabolic health, inflammation of the gut. Is there anything else that I'm missing there?
I would say there's two big things in the nutrition guidelines specifically. Sugar, sugar, processed carbohydrates, and seed oils are. They recommend seed oils. If you look at them, it's like have canola oil, avoid butter. Use sugar in moderation, which we know our moderation is such a strange and arbitrary term. Um,
Right.
yeah, I mean, you nailed it too. And what's interesting is there's this notion among doctors, when I worked in healthcare, that it's not the guidelines that are the problem, it's people aren't following them. People just need to eat more fruits and
Right.
vegetables. But when you look at the statistics, I've said this before, we're eating, as a nation, we're actually eating more fruits and vegetables. We're eating a
Mhm.
lot more wheat flour. But we have significantly decreased the amount of animal fats we eat, and the amount of oils, vegetable oils, has skyrocketed. It's over 200% more than what it was in the 70s. And I believe the combination of that, and the combination of increasing our processed carbohydrates and sugar, has just been this recipe for inflammation and oxidation and all kinds of chronic diseases.
Yeah, and the crazy thing is that used to be normal, like eating, higher amounts of meat and fat, like tallow, for example. Like I think McDonald's either used lard or tallow for their French fries
I think
before,
they did tallow. I think
right?
until the 80s, they did tallow. Yep.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. And so it's amazing that we had this complete 180-degree turn in our recommendations, and now we seem to kind of be slowly going back towards, a healthier way of eating. I guess people are like kind of like waking up to different ways of eating that were controversial, but now seem to have more evidence behind them.
Yeah, isn't it curious when you just take a step back? Like you said, it's still very controversial in the dietetics community to recommend like a low carb diet. It's like this is what humans evolved. This is, and it's like you'll see websites and stuff that say meat causes cancer, meat is inflammatory. It's like if that was true, the human race wouldn't exist. Like just take the emotion out of it for a second. Like let's just use common sense. It's amazing that we've truly allowed propaganda to override our common sense.
Yeah, no, I couldn't agree with you more. And I will say, part of what this podcast is about is me trying to be as objective as possible. And in that, I have found people like yourself. And I interviewed, I don't know if you know Dr. Mickey Bendor, but he's kind of a big controversial figure in anthropology because his theory on human evolution is that we pretty much evolved hunting very, very large animals, what he called megafauna. And so he thinks that the reason that our jaws got smaller, our skulls got thinner, and many other aspects of our basically physical degeneration over the past few thousand years since the agricultural revolution has been because we're not getting some of the nutrients that we used to have ample amounts of, which is another argument for animal-based eating. It's how can you say that meat is bad for you if it's literally one of the most nutrient dense foods that exist, right? It has vitamin K2, the preformed vitamin A. Like you have so many of these critical things that you will probably not get enough of in plant foods.
Yeah, I mean, I'm right there with you. And that's another thing that we're just not, if we're taught, it's so glazed over about the, once again, bioavailability. Because you'll have people come back and be like, oh, you can get vitamin K in leafy greens, but it's not the absorbable form. And we actually know there was a study that came out that about 45% of humans cannot absorb plant-based vitamin A. People are like, oh, you get vitamin A in carrots and sweet potatoes. It's like, no, that is not, your body actually has to go through a process to change that to a usable form of vitamin A. And not everyone has the genetic capabilities to do that. Where like obviously in the animal foods like liver, your body, you don't have to do that. So it's very absorbable.
Yes.
A lot of people have severe acne, skin issues and things. They desperately need vitamin A. They don't
Yeah.
need antibiotics or whatever they're usually prescribed.
Yeah.
And yeah, no, I did as well. And so it's interesting that there's just so many myths. Some of the biggest myths out there are that plant-based diets are good for the planet, they're good for human health. It's we all have a different physiology. I have a dog, I have a tortoise, and they eat very differently because they have very different physiology. Well, humans have a physiology that absorbs nutrition from, animal meat, fat, and organs incredibly well, and absorbs nutrition from plants pretty poorly. And that doesn't mean you can't have plants. I think a lot of people, I would say most people, can tolerate plants. And we know throughout evolution, especially when meat was scarce, people ate roots and, bark and berries and whatever was available. But that was a very, very small, that did not make up much of their calorie content, And so it's interesting to me that there's this whole wave of people that believe. And if you look at some of these, fake plant products, it's a total hoax. They're made with all kinds of artificial ingredients. And if you think getting Beyond Burger from Silicon Valley is good for the environment, then golly, it's once again, it's just propaganda. It's overriding people's common sense.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I agree with you. And I wanted to get, because I know you mentioned in your book, Diana Rogers, and I wanted to try to get her on because, she has some very compelling arguments, for meat eating, for sustainably sourced meat eating, right? And the fact that these cows, these grazers are such a crucial part of our ecosystem, of our keeping the earth healthy, basically. And if you get rid of those and you stop to eat those, and there's really no reason to care for them and allow them to, eat the grass and then poop on the grass and then actually fix carbon back into the soil, right? You don't have that anymore.
Yeah, we know that regenerative farming actually sequesters carbon in the soil. If you want to save the planet, in my opinion, it makes sense to live in a way, eat in a way, support things that put carbon back in the soil. And like you said, when you have I love that White Oak Pastures calls it radically traditional farming. I mean, this is what they
Mhm.
used to do before industrialized farming, is the
Yeah.
animals get to graze freely. And when they do that, like you said, they eat the grass, they poop, it basically is the cycle that is supposed to happen to make sure the soil is, fertile. And then, obviously we eat the animals, it nourishes our bodies, and the cycle keeps going. Like that's, in my opinion, how, how health is supposed to go, how nutrition is supposed to go. Unfortunately, it's very strange. I mean, there are some basic facts of nature, like, and that's another thing that I think is kind of silly about this plant-based movement, is like all life requires death.
Mm.
Veganism, we know that I believe it's about 8 billion animals are killed when you're growing, monocropping kale or soy or quinoa. Like life requires death. And just
Yeah.
because you're eating a soy burger, it doesn't mean that you haven't chopped up gophers and rabbits in order to
Yeah.
plant your soy. So, and as opposed to, you know, doing this dogmatic nonsense, it makes sense to say, like, how can I support a sustainable system? My wife and I are fortunate that we live very close to, we buy a cow share. We visited the farm, we've done a video actually on the farm. And our farmer says, my cows have one bad day. Their whole lives are amazing. Obviously the end of their life but it's very quick. It's over. And that's in my opinion how we should do things.
Yeah, I like that quote. There's only one bad day in their
One
life.
bad day.
Um, yeah, yeah, no, and I would much rather be, first of all, nourishing myself more by eating animals, and also when you're doing that, you are contributing to the life. You're part of the life cycle. You can't just opt out of the life cycle by choosing to be vegan. You just don't see it, right? And in a way, you're not only kind of pretending to opt out of the life cycle, but you're also depriving yourself of all of these different nutrients in meat.
Exactly. And I saw a pretty staggering trend when I work in psychiatric care. A lot of people believed that they needed to go plant-based, or plant-based could help their mental health. And there's nothing further from the truth. We know that neurotransmitters, specifically serotonin, require a lot of these cofactors that are, very bioavailable in meat, including B12, folate, iron, some zinc. And so, yeah, it's I like that. I'm gonna use it. You can't opt out of the life cycle, Once again, you can't, but it's amazing to me that we think that eating a Beyond Burger is good for the planet. We think that eating some processed bread between a processed patty with God knows what is good for your health or good for the planet. Like that's just not true.
Yeah, it's kind of amazing that I saw, who was it? It's a pretty popular dietitian actually in the plant-based space who had a post that said, I will recommend a Beyond Burger over, even like a grass-fed steak any day. And it's just wow, like can't believe that you would say that. Just given the ingredients, the laundry list of ingredients that you have in that thing.
Well, I will tell you that to be the dietitians that they're, Coca-Cola, Kellogg, some of them, they hire dietitians and they pay a lot of money. And, I've
Mm,
seen positions available. And so I don't know what this particular individual is working for or getting kickbacks from or whatever, but it can be a very, it's sad. And
yeah,
I would hope that nobody would willingly know. And that's one thing, like I can't practice in the hospital anymore. I was actually
right.
running the other day thinking how freaking ridiculous it is that I have all these student loans and did everything and I have all this knowledge and I can't even teach it because the system is so backwards and messed up, like
Yeah,
I would have to go and teach things that hurt people and I'm not doing it.
right.
And so yeah, it's tough. It's really tough. And so
Yeah.
you kind of have to either sell out or figure out something else.
It makes me very hopeful that there are people who cannot be bought out and people who are, willing to face the consequences of, going against the grain, even if it costs them either their medical license or, you can't practice in the hospital, you're still willing to say what is most true because you know what the conventional approach is and you saw that it wasn't working. And so you did something about it. I think like, the studies are great, like scientific research is great, but if that's your Bible and you can't innovate new solutions, if you can't think about any new way to come at a problem, then it kind of becomes something that's limiting rather than something that gives you good new information.
Yeah, I appreciate that. And, I do want to validate that, like, I've had a lot of people reach out to me that are in the hospital system and they are like, I don't know what to do, like dietitians, because I hear
Yeah.
you and I agree with you, but maybe they're not in a position to leave. Like
Yeah.
financially, their family's dependent on them. I mean, when I discovered my health, like I had to stay for like 6 months, like before I could figure out my next, step, just because
Yeah.
financially you have to kind of like figure out what you're going to do next. So I hear that and I'm so sorry. And I wish I had good advice or good answers. My best advice would be to do everything you can to find an exit, see if there's something else you can, network or other opportunity you can do. But you're right. And I think that one of the best things about, a low carb animal based approach is the results tend to be relatively quick. I had incredibly improved mental, like my reduction in anxiety in weeks, mental clarity, was able to run again within a month. Like
Hmm.
things change dramatically. And, obviously once you see it, you can't unsee it. But, we're also dealing with a population that is very addicted to sugar, addicted to processed foods. As a society, we have very poor coping mechanisms. We use food as a coping
Yeah.
strategy, and change is hard and scary. I'm sure you and I know, certainly I know people that won't give up soda, and we know how much better their health would be, or they won't give up something even though they struggle with depression or obesity. And that's also when people ask me like, oh my God, how do I change my dad, my mom, my brother, my friend? You
It's
cannot
tough.
change anybody. All you can do is, you live the example. And I always have a few phrases ready if people ask me like, oh, why'd you bring your own food, or why are you eating that? Just something quick like, oh yeah, my anxiety is so much better. But until people are ready, until people ask you,
Mhm.
it's really, you just have to live
Yeah.
it.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. I think at least at the beginning, right? And it's not to throw my parents under the bus, but when I first started learning a little bit more about nutrition and I would tell them things that I would learn, they'd be like, "Oh yeah, yeah, that's cool." But then I would see them, doing things that at the time I thought were unhealthy. So yeah, you cannot force change on someone. That's something that I've come to learn also as a health coach. It's like you are never supposed to do that. And yeah, because that's the way forward, right? It's like we can have these conversations with people who agree with us all we want, and it's fun and it's great to throw out new ideas. But if you can't have conversations with people who disagree and with people who are not on your side, right, of whatever argument it may be, then you can't go about changing people's lives and changing people's opinions for the better.
No, that's true. And so I think and that's one thing that I always strive to be too, is I want to be open. I always say I'm not afraid to be wrong. I'm wrong a lot, that's the only way we learn and grow and change. Is to evolve, adapt, and I also tell people that in nutrition, what starts working for you right now will shift as your goal shift.
Right.
Certainly as an ultra runner, my goals and needs are different than someone who maybe is obese and trying to lose weight or diabetic. um, but it is important. And I think it's important to, as a country, just Jesus, we're so polarized on opposite sides. So being able to hear somebody and, listen and validate, like I'm always up for hearing, often I certainly may not agree with what's being said, but no, I definitely hear that.
I want to shift gears a little bit towards mental health because this whole series is about, is red meat healthy for you? And I wanted to kind of tackle it from a bunch of different angles. And I know that where you came from was from eating disorders, from like not being able to perform athletically in some ways. So I really want to dig deeper on how exactly is it that some of the things that we're told to consume in the conventional nutritional guidelines may be hurting or harming our brain health? And
Sure.
then what are the things that you include into your diet which can actually be beneficial?
Yeah, so there's a couple different ways to kind of talk about mental health. So, the traditional nutrition guidelines tell you, like, oh, all these fruits and vegetables and whole grains are good for your brain. Your brain likes colorful fruits and vegetables. But, they've actually done several studies on that. They actually had a 7-year long study and followed people that were really strict on the nutrition guidelines, that reported depression, anxiety, before, and they actually got worse. A lot of them dropped out of the study. Um, and so, what we know about, certainly, like I said earlier, what we know about neurotransmitters, making sure we have those neurotransmitters as you need a lot of those vitamins, minerals, and cofactors. But a few things that I found really interesting, two things, one from Dr. Georgia Eid and the other from Dr. Chris Palmer. Dr. Georgia Eid was the first one who taught me that, when we consume a lot of processed foods, and we're talking seed oils, a lot of sugar, a lot of those ultra processed carbohydrates over time, those can actually have the same impact on neurotransmitters of our brain as a major trauma or illicit substances. And when I say that, what can happen, let's say you're someone who just massively eats, junk food every day, is most people are very familiar with like dopamine and serotonin, but glutamate is a neurotransmitter that's very important in your brain. Glutamate and GABA, your brain wants to keep that balance very, very stable. Well, when you eat too many processed foods over time, that can actually shift glutamate up to 100 times the normal level that it's supposed to be. And we see high levels of glutamate in victims of people that have committed suicide, people who have done a lot of illicit drugs. Your brain does not want to have glutamate up that high. And what happens when the glutamate shifts up that high is it actually suppresses neuroplasticity, meaning that your brain cannot mold, change, or adapt, and you can no longer cope with stress. So, what we have in society now is we have a lot of people who are, we're in a very stressful time, just coming off of COVID. And if you're trying to shift and change your behavior, but you're eating all this processed food, it's like that saying, it goes in one ear and out the other. You literally cannot change your behavior. They had an interesting study I cite in my book with cocaine that were dealing with cocaine addiction. And that where they found cocaine really shifted glutamate up very high. And the people who continued to use and they had high levels of glutamate relapsed. Like they could not override their brain's ability. They wanted, clearly they wanted to be abstinent. Right. And the whole moral of the study was, we need a drug that can fix this glutamate. But the point being, like, we need to keep that level. We need to do everything we can. When you eat ultra processed foods, not only do you get that glutamate shift, you get a rise in dopamine. Most people feel great. You feel euphoric if you're eating a lot of sugar or, it's high fat, high sugar, ultra processed foods. And then a lot of people will get a crash. So very, very damaging to mental health. And then we also know Dr. Chris Palmer has talked about that you can be insulin resistant in the brain and have zero signs of insulin resistance in the body. And what does that mean? Like if somebody is dealing with massive depression, severe anxiety, OCD, they go to a doctor, they get all their labs run, everything's normal. They talk to a psychiatrist, they get put on meds, maybe they don't get better, and that happens a lot in society. And we have a lot of people that think like, what, I'm just going to be depressed, anxious my whole life. Like this life just sucks. Maybe I'm in and out of institutions. But a good way to think about this concept is epilepsy. Babies are born with epilepsy. It's a seizure disorder. And when they eat glucose, when they take in sugar or carbs, they often have seizures. So what do? We put them on a ketogenic diet. So they're getting ketones to the brain. Right. Seizures stop. And so potentially, if you have insulin resistance in the brain, it's just the brain, for some people it's seizures. For some people, it's the areas of the brain are not communicating. And when we're fueling the brain with ketones, a lot of people are able to improve their mental health. Dr. Chris Palmer is actually doing a study on the ketogenic diet with schizophrenia to see how that improves. But that's just not, once again, that's not something we talk about. Most people that are diagnosed with a major depressive disorder, anxiety, are not going to be told by their practitioner, like, yeah, you really should, or just given the option, like, hey, we could try a ketogenic diet because potentially you have insulin resistance in the brain, So, yeah. I guess that's a long-winded way of saying that, certainly including meat, when I shared in the book, when I, for like 30 days, I pretty much just did beef and butter, cotton, salt, and coffee. My mental health went, I went from being so anxious, like I said, sometimes I couldn't call into work, to sleeping, being calm. Like my mental health improved significantly. That was one of the driving forces to write the book, was to talk about that improvement in mental health. So yeah, if there was a food I'd recommend for mental health, it would definitely be red meat.
That is, yeah. That is such a controversial thing to say, but I believe it's true also, because For myself, having dealt with depression and anxiety, and having like kind of a history of that, when I eat certain foods, I will feel, more anxious, or I'll feel just like a depression in mood for the next day. And it could even be for the next like few days. For example, if I have like a quote unquote like cheat meal or something that I usually don't eat. And so this totally makes sense to me. And I had a question about something you said about insulin resistance being found in the brain, but not the body. So
Mhm.
would that assume that the person is not overweight or obese, but could still have that going on in the brain?
Absolutely. Yeah. And I
Okay.
think that's one of the most difficult things is, you know, if you're obese and diabetic, like we can easily see that. It's like, oh, your A1C is high, your blood glucose is high. If, most doctors don't test fasting insulin, but your fasting insulin is, really high. But yeah, we don't have tests. We didn't even used to think the brain used or needed insulin, and now we know it does or it can.
Yeah.
So yeah, you can be super lean, you can be incredibly fit, and you can still have insulin resistance in the brain. And like why that happens, we don't know. Potentially like
Right.
epilepsy, it could just be like a genetic thing.
Wow. Yeah, and like that's crazy because one of the main arguments for like eating everything in moderation, which is like a huge thing that I think I actually want to ask you about also because I know
Sure.
you're against kind of that idea. Um, if you have someone who looks fit, but in their brain they're not able to, create energy like they should be. They are insulin resistant. They're not able to use glucose very effectively. Because one of the arguments is that if you are a good body weight, then you basically almost can't have insulin resistance. It's like I've seen that kind of messaging with nutritionists and dietitians.
Mhm.
Like even if you do, basically their whole point is if you calorie restrict, then basically you're fine. Or if you just eat at maintenance, like you're fine no matter what composition of those foods they are, right?
Well, and that's the myth that will never die. This little calorie nonsense. Like, my 6-year-old niece can tell you that 600 calories of donuts have a different how she feels with 600 calories of chicken. It's so silly that some people think you can eat anything, and it has nothing to do with well, I shouldn't say nothing, but less to do with the energy density, meaning the calories versus what does it have? What impact does it have on the hormones in your body?
Right.
And so obviously there's a very different, you eat 600 calories of donuts, you're going to get a glucose spike, an insulin rush, probably some cortisol, all this stuff. Where obviously if you eat 600 calories of meat, you're going to have a much more stable, release of hormones. So yeah, you can be, and like, once again, just going back to the epilepsy, like babies are born with epilepsy, and there's nothing, they didn't do anything wrong to get it. It's just genetic. And we also know that there's a lot of people who are very lean that are what they call skinny fat, have a lot of visceral fats,
Hmm.
potentially around their organs. So, what you look like, I would say, doesn't necessarily isn't gonna probably is not gonna show you very well what's going on in your brain. You can be super lean, healthy, and fit, and be massively depressed. Have some,
Right.
you know, dysfunction, miscommunication going on in your brain. So, I mean, I would say anybody who's struggling with depression, anxiety, and certainly we know that like some of the basic things, reducing sugar, exercise can help with mood. But truly, if it is an insulin issue in your brain, it makes sense to take that out of the equation, at least, or reduce it. See if you can't be fueling off fat and ketones.
So the first kind of thing, which we're challenging here with the conventional dogma of nutrition, is basically like the whole grains, essentially, or even like the not only the whole grains but the processed carbohydrates. Like both can still be very can raise your blood sugar up super super high and then like come crashing down later on. What else is it about the nutritional guidelines that could be harmful for brain health and mood?
Oh man. Um, I think that obviously the base, I mean, you nailed it, is that carbohydrates. And I thought so much more about this after my trip, just because, when you can eat, yeah, so many people start their day eating these cereals, bagels, pastas, all the, or not pastas, but like, breads. And when you start your day that way, you're basically setting yourself up to be hungry. I mean, and
Right.
you need animal meat and fat. And so people are just eating so many carbohydrates. They're just not getting we're becoming massively overfed, and and malnourished for the first time in history. We're an
Yeah.
overfed, malnourished society. I would also say that, protein is such a small part of that equation. It's so silly to me because, protein, I mean, it comes from the Greek word proteus. It's of first importance. It's so important in the body. Everybody thinks protein's like, muscle, which obviously it's important in muscle building, but it makes your hormones, it lets your cells communicate. It's part of your immune system. It's so important. So to say like, oh, you only need a few ounces a day is nonsense. And then their fat is at the very tip, and it says use sparingly. And they want you to use canola oils and other nonsense where it's like, ideally, we would be taking in a lot of fat. When you take in fat, you're going to be satiated,
Mhm.
like once again, when you're eating all these carbohydrates, they are setting you up to be hungry. And, when you eat carbohydrates, I mean, one thing that I like to teach, I always tell people, if you take nothing else away from a talk, insulin suppresses fatty acid oxidation. That's a very fancy way of saying when you get an insulin response, it shuts down your body's ability to burn fat for fuel. Ideally, we want to be burning as much fat for fuel throughout the day. That if you're not trying to lose weight, it keeps your energy stable, you're feeling great. If you are trying to lose weight, you certainly want to be able to tap into your own body fat. But every single day, we're telling our body, don't burn fat, burn sugar. Don't burn fat, burn sugar. Even our kids, it's like, I have Fruit Loops, I have this insulin spike, I have a granola bar, I have it, like constantly eating pastas and sandwiches and carbs and carbs and carbs and carbs. So, but when you have a nutrition guidelines that say that should be the base of our diet, we have all these dietitians saying, eat this, eat that, eat all this, eat these in moderation, which, we can talk about that too. And then we have these things that we really should make up the base of our diet being kind of pigeonholed into small, um, parts of the nutrition plan. And then things like fruits and vegetables. I mean, the nutrition guidelines even count like a fresh juice is a serving of fruit. Nobody should be drinking juice unless you're like accidentally someone gave you too much insulin and you're going like scary hypoglycemic. Like you don't need juice. Like that's
Mm.
terrible for human health.
Yeah.
Um, so yeah, I mean, they're
Yeah.
all kinds of wrong.
Tell me about the oils a little bit more, because I know you talked about like canola and like vegetable seed oils. What's the problem with those in terms of like emotional and brain health?
Yeah, and I wish I'd written a little bit more about this in my book. I learned I learned more about it kind of at post publication. But what we know is just that they're inflammatory. They're basically inflammatory, and they also cause oxidation. There are two things that can really cause oxidation and heart disease. Because people, that's another thing we could talk about. I'll kind of wrap this around to mental health. Um, when during the 70s specifically, people like freaked out about saturated fat and meat because you look in like occluded arteries and you would actually see LDL. You would see this like, so what people thought was, oh my God, we eat animal meat and fat, our LDL goes up, that's clogging arteries. But then,
Right.
like you said, we look at those traditional cultures that eat the Inuit Eskimos, 80% fat, and they have no heart disease. So the question is, what is causing the LDL to get stuck in the arteries? Well, one thing we know that there has to be damage. Something has to get damaged in your arteries for it to get stuck. And one of the main drivers of damage is hyperglycemia over time. So if you're eating a lot of sugar and processed carbohydrates, that's why we know that type 2 diabetics have a 2 to 4-fold risk. And also oils, these seed oils can actually damage our arteries. Seed oils are very damaging. They lack everything in the human bodies. Ideally, it's supposed to work synergistically. Like when you eat, meat, it's not just, once again, the protein, it's all the vitamins and minerals. It's supposed to work. It works perfectly and synergistically in your body. When you eat these vegetable oils, it causes damage. It causes inflammation. It's a man-made product that really shouldn't be in the human body. So once again, that can do that same thing we talked about with processed carbohydrates and sugar. That can shift glutamate up. That can make it difficult to cope with stress. That can make it difficult to think clearly. It's a mess, and it's really sad to me. I mean, we have whole aisles in our grocery stores that are basically like like damn. I mean, instead of like cooking oils, it should be changed to like health destroyers. This aisle.
Yeah, I was actually talking to someone about that a couple of months ago. Like they should have in products, like if they're GMO, they should have like GMO rich or like pesticide rich or like, all the
Yeah.
things that are bad, like they should have on the label, right? Like all of those things that are potentially negative. And in terms of the oils, they were actually first used for automotive purposes. Like they were first used as like in machine shops. And just knowing how they're made. I mean, I know there's a lot of controversy around seed oils like canola, soybean, like grapeseed, all of those things. But just knowing how they're made, how they're produced is honestly enough to make me say this cannot possibly be a health food that's, heart healthy. Like there's no way that's possible. Like you take a soybean and you put it under immense pressure and immense heat, and then you mix it with like a some solvent, some chemical solvent to try to get rid of the disgusting smell and the disgusting how it looks because it's foggy at the beginning. And it's like there is no possible way this is a health food.
Yeah. Well, it never was, it's not, the only reason it got the heart healthy stamp is because the government and all their wisdom decided that butter was bad because, like we talked, I mean, they thought it caused heart disease, which it doesn't. And so they're like, wow, what a, vegetable oil, it's low in saturated fat. This must be good because butter is bad. It's all
Mhm.
based on false premises. And of course, there's a lot of funding too that these companies pay, these vegetable oils company pay to have those, quote unquote heart healthy um, insignias on there. So yeah, it's ridiculous. It's like, who thought it was a good idea to pump hydrogen into things like partially hydrogenated oils? Like if you look at traditional peanut butters, like that peanut butter will live longer than you and I. Like that can't be good. They're literally pumping hydrogen into it. That's what hydrogenation is, to make things last until, the world ends. That is not a healthy thing to put in your body.
Yeah, in terms of some cofactors that are included in meat, some vitamins and minerals, because you mentioned how vitamin A, the plant form, is difficult to turn into the more active form. That only like a few people, select people, can actually do that efficiently.
Mhm.
Is there anything else, and specifically anything else that are in animal foods that you wouldn't be able to get or absorb as much from plant foods that could potentially boost brain health and mood?
Oh yeah, I mean, iron is a huge one. I mean, iron, people associate iron with just oxygenation of your cells and energy, but it's important in brain health. Zinc is incredibly important. B12, B12, there's no B12 in plants. I believe those are the main ones. Someone's going to come back and be like, you forgot, blah, blah, blah. I'm sure there's more B vitamins, I mean, the B
Yeah,
vitamins are mostly in animal proteins.
right.
And, this isn't here to say specifically that like plants, you can certainly get some nutrition from plants, but it's so much smaller and there's just not enough. There's not enough. You'd have to eat so much plants to try to get enough nutrition. And then there's often those anti-nutrients in plants that are going to cause you to not absorb them as well. So yeah, I mean, it's ruminant animals are really a game changer when it comes to mental health. If somebody is listening to this and really struggling with mental health, really taking the time to reduce or eliminate a lot of those carbohydrates, specifically ones that are going to bind with vitamins and minerals, the ones high in phytic acid and lectins and oxalates. Really taking some time to focus on those ruminant animals is it's a game changer.
Is there any research into how potentially anti-nutrients? Because the way that I think about some anti-nutrients is that for some people, again, this isn't saying like everyone needs to just avoid all plant foods, but for some people who are more sensitive to these things like lectins, oxalates, phytic acid, all those kind of things, um, are those? Wow, I totally lost my train of thought.
No,
um,
I got you. Like, oh, are some people maybe more sensitive, or like, how do we figure
Yeah.
out? Like,
Oh,
there's a lot of questions around
yeah.
that.
So what I was getting to was, could those potentially harm the gut in a way which harms, brain health, or mood? Because, you make like a lot of the serotonin in your gut, for example.
Yeah, I honestly don't know if there's like a specific clinical trial I could point you to, but I think we
Yeah.
can pretty confidently say that we know. I mean, we do know that certain plants, the anti-nutrient specific daily lectins, some of the glutens, oxalates can impact the gut. And we, like you said,
Mhm.
the gut is often called the second brain.
Right.
And even thinking about it, people are like, do what does your gut tell you? What is your
Yeah.
um and how I like to think about like anti-nutrients, because people are like, oh my God, can I never have peanut butter or plants or whatever again? Well, if you're coming from a place where your health is pretty poor, like a flashback to when I was 2019, when I was a mess, my health was a mess, if you've been eating processed foods or obese or severely depressed, your gut's probably damaged. Your body probably needs a break. So what I think, makes the most sense to do is to really eliminate those foods, focus on those nutrient dense animal foods and fats. And then, you can slowly add things back in. I found there's a few select plant foods that I consume regularly now that I have new issues with, carrots, berries, a few other things. But yeah, some people, and we don't know if it's more genetic, are very sensitive. My wife, actually, she's Italian too, so she's just hates it, but she's very sensitive to nightshades. They cause pain, so tomatoes, peppers, tomatoes are a big sadness. But yeah, so we know the brain and the gut are connected. To what degree and to how much anti-nutrients affect that, I certainly can't say for sure, but I think this is also kind of interesting why we're all an experiment of one per se. I've had some
Yes.
people have, really incredible, like myself, really impressive, quick results. Some people, it takes a little bit longer. Some people may even do better than I do. Some people may not see a huge difference, but in my opinion and my experience is I've seen just so many improvements, like over and over again, to where I've presented on these things at major conferences, and mental health and eating disorder recovery when we focus on meat and fat and we really reduce or eliminate, carbohydrates, at least for a period of time.
Have you ever had patients who actually don't do well, like with low carb or with animal-based eating?
That's a great question. I've seen people that have some autoimmune issues that just didn't respond, and that's always kind of crummy, because you're like,
Yeah,
they're doing everything and they're still having like rheumatoid arthritis, they're having pain.
right.
The biggest problems I've seen when people do really poorly, and I've
Hmm.
seen some people do really poorly, is they well, two things. One, certainly coming from the eating disorder world, people will embrace a meat and fat diet and undereat. It's like I went
Mm,
from undereating the standard American diet. Now I feel better because I'm not getting a lot of the sugar and nutrient, their nonsense from processed foods, but I'm still under eating. And
mm,
so now I'm just underweight with this, animal foods. So that's unfortunate. I see that
mm.
sometimes.
Okay.
Oh, and I think many people need some carbohydrates. There's kind of or can benefit, especially if you're active, you're a premenopausal woman during around your period. It can benefit you, behoove you to have 25 to 50 grams of carbs. And people get so much health with this like zero carb diet that they get afraid, like, oh, I don't want to
Yeah.
add anything back. It can actually set you back. So then that's why I always include, ask people to be open, don't be dogmatic, because the goal, I always say there's like no medals for being zero carb or all animal based. The goal is metabolic health and
Yeah.
metabolic flexibility. We want to
Right.
be able to burn carbs and fat, and we want to be able to, enjoy life. And I think it makes sense to be able to enjoy some fruit, some honey, some things. And for most people, once you're metabolically healthy, once again, there's a big difference between a metabolically healthy human and someone who's maybe 400 pounds, obese, diabetic. They probably need to be zero carb or very, very low carb for a while. So those would be the biggest groups that I see that struggle.
Okay, got it. What do you think about fiber for brain health and just overall health? Because I know that's something that's, there are a lot of books that I've seen. One that I read a couple years ago called The Mind Gut Connection, which really advocates for more plant-based, I guess, just because the idea is if you're eating these prebiotic fibers that are fueling your gut microbiome, you're producing more butyrate, you're producing more of those short chain fatty acids. Your gut is healthier, and then in a way you're also kind of creating more serotonin in your gut, and then that can be helpful for brain health. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I kind of lean the other direction. And, I read some really good papers, even from Dr. Lustig, and they really are more fans of fiber. I mean, still low carb, but it doesn't it doesn't make sense to me. And that we know that throughout history, I mean, especially in Arctic conditions, people would go for sometimes years without eating fiber, decades without eating fiber. And certainly working in the hospital setting, I've seen people have more problems. It's fiber is this like magical thing. People are like, oh, you're constipated, you need fiber, you need fiber. And it's
Mm,
like, oh, you have diverticulitis, oh, once we get your system calmed down, you need fiber. And it's like, it causes more problems than I think it actually can help.
Mm.
As far as fueling the microbiome, I mean, we just don't have good evidence that that's the case. Like we really don't. And people that say they do, I don't. I'd love to see your research, but we know that people who eat, mostly meat diets have a pretty diverse microbiome. And once again, I am a fan of having some plant foods. I think we know through history there was no vegan culture, there was no carnivore culture.
Mhm.
Everybody ate some barks and this, and
Yes.
mostly meat. So I don't necessarily think you have to have, I wouldn't ever tell someone like you need the specific amount of fiber to fuel your body to feel good. I think, like I said, I think it does more harm than good. I mean, it was funny when I was hanging out with my sister. She was like, "God, you don't eat any plants, really, huh?" And I'm like, "Nah." It wastes calories too. Like I need the room. My body as an athlete requires 3,500, sometimes 4,000 calories. Like I'm not waste that in lettuce. I need beet and fat.
Yeah.
And guess what? Half of our society thinks eating a salad for lunch is great. Well, guess what? They're hungry. And now they fill their
Mm.
stomach up with this nonsense. And so they're going to have gas and bloating and all these issues when they would have been much better just eating some ground beef. So but I'm open. I'm open to
Yeah.
that. If the research comes out that says like, hey, you know what? You are much better if you have 10 grams of plants or fiber or something, then I'm happy to have that discussion.
Yeah. Yeah. And I love that you said that. There's not very convincing and solid evidence for the fact that fiber is really this essential thing for a healthy microbiome. I think, first of all, there are so many things which play into a healthy microbiome, like your psychological stress, for example, has been shown to affect your gut microbiome. The amount of exercise and types of exercise you do can affect the microbiome. Your exposure, I mean, the things you're breathing in every day can
Hmm.
affect your microbiome. And the most balanced of physicians and health professionals like you, which I've talked to, they say the exact same thing. They say, look, like I get that you're vegan and maybe it helped you because you transitioned from a really, really bad diet, from the standard American diet, you transitioned to whole foods, plant-based, right? And yeah, that's better than the standard American diet. But was it really the fact that you went vegan and excluded animal products that made you healthy, or was it the fact that you were excluding the standard American diet products of processed stuff, right?
Yeah.
And so I would agree, just from the experts that I've interviewed on the gut microbiome. There was a study by Dr. Lucy Mailing, who I think it was called Reframing Nutritional Microbiota Studies. I'll link to it in the description, but it talked about exactly that, how we are so flexible as a species to different fuels. And to think that, like you said, we needed fiber in all contexts to fuel a good microbiome to be healthy is probably not right. Our gut microbiome can adapt to actually use different sorts of fuels, right? Like it can even use like some metabolites of fat as fuel, and amino acids as fuel, rather than just relying on the fiber. So yeah, I would agree with you there. I wanted to talk a little bit more about the eating disorders, because you mentioned that, for yourself, that was something that was incredibly liberating. We know that certain foods that are hyper palatable, um, in brain studies, it shows that they have very similar effects as drug abuse. So for you, how did going animal based help, and how can going animal based or going low carb help with that, I guess?
Yeah. And, I totally validate if anybody hears this, like, the standard advice is that if you have a dysfunctional relationship with food, if you're anorexic, bulimic, deal with binge eating disorder, orthorexia, you should never in a million years go low carb. Like I was told that, like, no keto, no this, no that. Um, and I think the advice comes from a good place. But, I say a couple of things first. First, I think we need to redefine what is food. Telling someone with an eating disorder, like, you have to eat all things in moderation. That's equating, you have to be able to eat meat and chicken and cookies and Oreos, and is really setting somebody up for failure. So for me, certainly, and I talked about this. My wife was not thrilled about this. She thought it was eating disordered and restrictive. But like I said, I felt very liberated when I changed how I ate and I started eating, all this bioavailable nutrition and fat. I believe too, my blood sugar finally stabilized and my brain finally was synapsing and focusing correctly. And for the first time in a long time, I was calm. I wasn't worried about food. I was excited to eat because I actually felt good. Like I would eat a meal and my stomach would hurt. I'd get anxious and, sometimes dizzy. Like I didn't have those symptoms anymore. It was, I felt like I felt more connected to food because I was learning more about it. You know, I was visiting farms, we were raising chickens. It, it became like a really good and powerful thing to nourish my body. And I no longer crave, you know, I couldn't go for more than a few hours without eating before. And I could go, you know, easily 5 to 6 hours. Like that was,
Hmm.
that in itself just felt great. And
Hmm.
it felt good to be able to sit down and easily eat over 1,000 calories. I couldn't, that was hard for me to do on a high carbohydrate diet because all that sugar and carbs would just make me sick to my stomach. So yeah, you know, and my argument to people, a couple things. There's a great study, you know, they did a case study with Dr. Sati Shabani, with a year long people, 3 people that had severe binge eating disorder. They were put on a ketogenic diet. And these were 3 people who didn't know each other, you know, different parts of the United States. And they all had complete remission. And these were people that had been struggling for decades. They also were all morbidly obese. They all lost weight during the study. They
Hmm.
also all improved symptoms of depression, you know, and
Mm.
we know, I mean, we know just stabilizing blood sugar can help, but I also would theorize that these people are finally getting bioavailable nutrition. And
Yeah.
for someone dealing with anorexia, you know, how we treat people with anorexia is a crime. You know, these people, like when I was 12 and I was, you know, starving to death, 57 pounds, 5 feet tall, you're immediately put on a tube feeding system that's full of maltodextrin and sugar. You're forced to eat 3,000 calories of the standard American diet, which is carbs and carbs and sugar. I mean, your starvation damages your intestinal epithelium. Your system is damaged. You cannot absorb things. I had so many GI issues. Also, your brain. We know the gray and the white matter of the brain atrophy, so it needs saturated fat. And you're fed canola oil. You're fed all these inflammatory oils. And so, to me, you know, if we're going to restore health and renourish, you know, somebody's body, it needs to be in a way that's going to support support their health. And so, you know, but I also validate that, you know, this really, I would highly recommend anybody who's in eating disorder recovery to work with somebody, you know, a dietitian, a doctor, that is very familiar with ketogenic and low carb diets, because most people are going to tell you, no, that'll set you back, blah. But, you know, it's so dumb. Like, it's like everything else in healthcare. It's like eating disorders have the highest mortality rate of any psychiatric disorder, anorexia specifically. And more people will die of anorexia than major depression, schizophrenia. I mean, the relapse rate is through the roof. It's like we can't keep doing the same dumb thing and expecting people to heal,
Mhm.
you know? So it's like all these medical professionals and dietitians that are like, oh, that's restrictive. Stop it. You know, like you're not helping push the paradigm. You're just parroting this nonsense you've learned. So I get fired up about it. So anyway, that would be my recommendation, because
Yeah.
and this disease is multifaceted. You know, people are like, well,
Right.
it's not just the food, it's your trauma. Well, guess what? When your stomach doesn't hurt and your mind is clear and your body's nourished, it's a lot easier to work on your trauma.
Facts.
So
Yeah.
and that's like, I say that a little bit like tongue in cheek, but I can tell you, and I've interviewed many people, the same thing.
Hmm.
Recovering from an eating disorder is one of the hardest things people will ever do, hardest thing I've ever done in my life. But it's a lot easier when you have the mental clarity and fortitude. So
Right. Yeah. When you can process all that.
exactly.
Yeah. How much time do we have, by the way? I don't want to keep you over your
Oh,
time.
I don't. Yeah, yeah, I'm good for a
Okay.
little bit.
Okay.
So
Good.
yeah.
Because I wanted to talk about saturated fat, which is what you mentioned. You know, you don't need the canola oils when you're healing from an eating disorder. You need the
Yeah.
saturated fat to help with brain health. And a lot of people would kind of cringe at that and be like, "What? Like saturated fat? Like, why would you ever like recommend saturated fat?" Um, so could you kind of explain your thought process behind that? And also, you mentioned a pretty large study in your book which showed kind of outcomes of consuming saturated fat on health.
Yeah, well, like once again, the premise that saturated fat was bad. I mean, it's kind of a long history. You know, basically started with Ansel Keys, and people were freaking out about heart health, and you know, he reported in his study. I mean, he basically found that meat and animal products did not cause saturated fat, but that didn't match his hypothesis. So he left out half of his study and just said, "Oh, look at these." So we have this guy who did this incomplete reporting. Sugar industry paid two scientists from Harvard to throw saturated fat under the bus and publish this, and at that point you didn't have to tell where your funding is coming from. Now you're supposed to disclose where you're getting funding from.
Right.
And yeah, and in my book, in my chapter on heart disease, we talk about all these studies where people, the higher their LDL, the less chance they had of having mortality. They had less chance of having infections and less chance. And like study after study came back saying like, hey, look, we shouldn't be recommending that people necessarily reduce their LDL. And I've said before, it's like we can't look at LDL in a vacuum, because yes, if you eat a ton of saturated fat, your LDL will go up. But there's a lot of hypothesis that LDL is actually important in your immune system. It is actually important function, has critical functions in your body. LDL only becomes a problem when you have inflammation and oxidation, which what is that caused by? Like I said earlier, it's caused by hyperglycemia. If you're diabetic, that's a problem. You don't want high LDL. But it's not the saturated fat that's causing the problem. It's the sugar. So we know too that saturated fat has, a lot of vitamins, minerals, that you need. Those fat soluble vitamins, A, D, E, and K. And just once again, if we can just take a step back, and if you don't know or care about science, just use your common sense. Like we evolved eating nothing but meat and saturated fat. We are completely healthy and free of chronic disease.
Yeah, I saw a study similar to that too, where people who were older, like into their beyond their 60s and 70s, who had higher LDL actually, had lower all-cause mortality and lower, instances of neurodegeneration like dementia and things like that. So I'll take my chances with that.
Yes, me too. Me as well.
I wanted to ask you, because there's a counter argument to consuming fat instead of consuming like carbohydrates, which is that excess fat can also cause insulin resistance. So what would be your kind of thoughts on that?
I've seen no good studies on that. And, like I said, I worked for 11 years and I never, and I even actually did a poll with my dietitians and said, I got 49 people to respond. Have you ever had someone come into your hospital on a ketogenic diet for any reason?
Mm-hmm.
I never saw it. I personally never saw anybody that was like, man, I'm eating all this meat and saturated fat and I'm diabetic. Never happened. And of the 49 people that responded to my poll, only one person had someone come into their hospital on a ketogenic diet, and they were a cyclist that crashed. So,
yeah.
So just to answer your question, like, I don't see how that happens. The only thing I could possibly think of is if you were just guzzling canola oil, maybe if you're doing enough inflammation, but once again, I don't know if that would mess your hormones up enough. That's out of my area of expertise, but
okay.
It doesn't,
yeah.
To me, it doesn't make sense, because we know that fat is very stable. Fat minimizes the insulin response. We get minimal out of the three macronutrients: protein, carbohydrates, and fat. Fat is level as a board. We get a little bit from protein and a much higher response from carbohydrates. So it's like, to me, that doesn't make sense.
Yeah.
But I'm open to, and I'm certainly would be open to hearing, and I could be wrong about vegetable oil. Maybe vegetable oil does something that I don't know about as far as that.
Right. Yeah. No, the reason I ask is because I've had several clients now who've done like ketogenic diets, and some of them will say, like I had one, for example, who listened to Dr. Stephen Gundry, and this is not to like trash Dr. Stephen Gundry, but he sells an olive oil that is apparently like a really good quality olive oil. And my client said that her doctor, who recommended that oil to her, said, here, consume like 6 tablespoons of this every single day, in addition to the food you're already eating. Right. And she was following like paleo-ish, and she gained weight. Right. And so that's where kind of my opinion has evolved to be like, well, maybe you probably can overdo it on the fat if you're adding excess oils to kind of everything.
Oh yeah, I mean, for
Yeah.
sure. Like if you're already eating like a relatively paleo diet, I mean, you're getting a couple
Yeah.
hundred grams of carbs, and you add 1,000 grams of fat. I mean,
Yeah.
unless you're running like me and my coach, unless you're
Yeah.
running 100 miles a week, that might not be the best thing to do. But when I'm talking like a very low carbohydrate, high fat diet, I have not seen that. If you're doing 60 to 70% fat, I'd be very surprised if you'd have any types of insulin resistance. But if you're doing a moderate carbohydrate diet, and you start adding quite a bit of oils, I mean, I could see that. But once
Right.
again, I don't think it's the oils.
Right. Right.
I think
Right.
it's the carbs.
Yeah, I think, yeah, the main argument that I've seen that I agree with is that you can either go low fat, and if that works for you, then great. Or you can either do low carb, but you can't really do like a mixture of the two where you're trying to be somewhere in between, because that can sometimes go off the rails for people who do tend to, overeat.
Yeah, no, and I agree. And yeah, we do know there are some people who follow very low fat diets that seem to do okay.
Yeah. My final question for you, what would you say to someone who is, what would you say to someone who's vegan and who, is very like set in their ways and just hasn't heard anything outside of that, but they're kind of struggling with their health?
Well, are they asking my opinion? Because if not, I'm not saying anything to
Yes.
them. Okay, they straight up asked my opinion.
Yes.
I think I would say, if you're open, let's just talk about the science. I'd ask, do you want to hear the science, or what are you open to? Or maybe even ask, like, why did you go vegan in the first place?
Mhm.
And if they say, well, I did it for my health. Okay, well, are you open to hearing about like how, some animal products can actually benefit your health? And maybe like, oh, I want to do it for the animals. Well, you're open to me talking about, veganism may not actually be best for the animals. So, I mean, I can hit it from any point they talk about, because, they want to
Yeah.
talk about the planet, it's not good for the planet. You want to talk about animals, not good for animals. Want to talk about health, it's not good for health. But I would be happy to, you have to meet people where they're at. And a lot
Yeah.
of people you have to be kind of gentle with. Say, well, maybe we could start with something simple. Like, how do you feel about adding some eggs to your diet? How do you feel about maybe, okay, seeing how you feel? How do you feel about this? Um, yeah, I mean, it's hard for me because I just think veganism is one of the biggest scams, it's also such a privileged thing, it's like if you don't have this money to supplement and to go to Whole Foods and buy all this stuff, you're going to get sick over time. So, but I would be kind. I would share the research, and I would try to slowly move them towards getting some bioavailable protein and fat.
Yeah. Where can people find out more about you? I know you have your book, The Dietitian's Dilemma,
Yeah.
which I actually have around here. But
So the Dietitian's Dilemma is on Amazon. I've got the paperback, Audible, and ebook. Honored if y'all check that out. I'm going to be publishing a low carbon endurance course very soon by the
Mhm.
end of April. So I'm super excited about that. But I'm most active on Instagram at Run, Eat, Meet, Repeat, all one word. On Twitter at Michelle Hearn RD. My website, thedietitiansdilemma.net, can link you directly to me or to my book. And yeah, I think that's it.
Amazing. Thank you so much for your time.
Hey, you're so welcome. Thanks for having me.